Well, hello there, folks. Welcome back to After Her Lies. I'm your host, Harold McKinney, though most of you just call me Gramps Harold. Or for those of you just tuning in, this is episode 41 of my little corner of the internet, where I share the real stories that life threw at me during my 67 years on this spinning rock. Now, before we dive into today's tale, I gotta ask you something that breaks this old heart of mine every single time I check my analytics. YouTube tells me that 96 of you beautiful souls watching this are doing so without hitting that subscribe button. 96%. That means out of every 100 people watching, only 4 of you think old Gramps Harold is worth a subscription. Chuckles sadly. I know I'm not the flashiest YouTuber out there. No fancy graphics, no jump cuts every 2 seconds. Just an old man in his basement office sharing stories that shaped him. But if these stories mean something to you, if they make you feel less alone in this world, would you consider subscribing? It would mean the world to this old-timer. And hey, while you're at it, give this video a thumbs up if you think it's worth your time. I read every single comment you leave, and they brighten up my days more than you know. Sometimes I sit here in the evenings, reading your thoughts and reactions, and it reminds me that we're all connected by these threads of human experience. Takes a deep breath and settles back in his chair. Today's story. Well, this one's been sitting heavy in my chest for about 3 decades now. It's about Margaret. Not my late wife Dolores, God rest her soul, but another woman entirely. A woman who waltzed into my life during what I thought were my settled years and turned everything upside down like a tornado in a trailer park. This happened back in 1993. I was 36 years old, married to Dolores for 12 years, and we had our 2 kids. Tommy was 8, and little Sarah was just 5. We lived in a modest 3-bedroom house on Maple Street in Cedar Falls, Iowa. You know the type. White picket fence, 2-car garage, the American dream wrapped up in vinyl siding, and a mortgage that kept me up at night sometimes. I worked as a regional sales manager for Midwestern Agricultural Supply Company. Not glamorous, but it paid the bills and kept food on the table. My territory covered a good chunk of Iowa and parts of Illinois, which meant I spent a lot of time on the road, staying in holiday inns and eating at truck stops. Dolores used to pack me sandwiches, always turkey and Swiss with that yellow mustard I liked. It was on one of these road trips that I first saw Margaret. I'd driven down to Peoria, Illinois, for a big agricultural expo. Picture this. Thousands of farmers, dealers, and suppliers all crammed into the Peoria Civic Center, trying to hawk their wares and make connections. The air thick with the smell of coffee, cigarettes, and that particular mixture of aftershave and nervous sweat that comes with big business deals. I was manning our company's booth, a modest setup with some product brochures and a banner that had seen better days, when she walked by. Now, I need you to understand something. I was a faithful husband. In 12 years of marriage, I'd never so much as looked twice at another woman. But Margaret. She was something else entirely. She was probably in her early 30s, with auburn hair that caught the fluorescent lights like it had fire woven through it. She wore a simple navy blue business suit, but the way she carried herself made it look like haute couture. What really got me, though, were her eyes. They were this unusual shade of green, not bright like emeralds, but deeper, like the color of a forest pond in late summer. She stopped at our booth, picked up one of our fertilizer brochures, and asked, "Do you carry anything organic?" Now, back in 1993, organic farming wasn't the big thing it is today. Most farmers were still going full chemical, and our company was no exception. I should have just said no and moved on to the next customer. Instead, I found myself saying, "We don't currently, but I'd be happy to look into it for you. What kind of operation are you running?" She smiled. And folks, that smile was like sunshine breaking through storm clouds, and said, "I'm not running anything yet. I'm Margaret Sinclair, and I'm doing research for a book about sustainable farming practices." A book? In 1993, in Peoria, Illinois, I was talking to an actual author. I felt like I'd stumbled into a different world entirely. We ended up talking for nearly an hour. She told me about her research, how she was traveling across the Midwest, interviewing farmers and suppliers about the changing face of agriculture. I found myself sharing things I'd never told anyone. My concerns about soil depletion, my observations about how farming had changed since I was a kid visiting my grandfather's farm in Nebraska. When she finally left, she handed me her business card and said, "If you ever find yourself in Chicago, I'd love to continue this conversation over a proper meal." Harold pauses, removes his glasses, and cleans them slowly. I kept that card in my wallet for 3 weeks before I called her. I told myself it was business, that maybe I could help her research, and our company could benefit from being mentioned in her book. But deep down, I knew better. The first time I drove to Chicago to meet her, I told Dolores it was for a client meeting. The lie came so easily it scared me. Margaret had suggested we meet at a little Italian place called Carmela's on the north side. It was nothing fancy. Red checkered tablecloths, Chianti bottles with candle wax dripped all over them, the works. But sitting across from her in that dim lighting, talking about everything from farming to philosophy to her travels in Europe, I felt more alive than I had in years. She was writing more than just a book about farming, it turned out. She was working on a novel too. Something about a woman who inherits her family's farm and has to decide between selling it to developers or fighting to save it. She'd grown up in Wisconsin, the daughter of a literature professor and a librarian. She'd gone to Northwestern, studied journalism, and had worked for a magazine in New York for several years before deciding she wanted to write something meaningful. "I got tired of writing about celebrity diets and fashion trends," she told me, twirling spaghetti around her fork with a grace I'd never seen in a truck stop diner. "I wanted to write about things that matter: land, tradition, the people who feed America." Over the next 6 months, I found excuses to drive to Chicago once, sometimes twice a month. I told Dolores I was developing new client relationships in the Chicago market. She never questioned it. Why would she? In 12 years, I'd never given her reason to doubt me. Margaret and I would meet at different restaurants, sometimes museums, once at a subs game, where she taught me to keep score properly. We talked about everything. She told me about her childhood in Madison, how her father would read her poetry in 3 different languages. I told her about growing up in small-town Iowa, about my father who worked at the grain elevator and never said much, but taught me everything about hard work and integrity just by example. The physical attraction was undeniable, but it was more than that. Margaret made me feel like the most interesting man in the world. She'd ask me about crop rotation techniques, like I was revealing the secrets of the universe. She'd listen to my stories about difficult customers and find profound meaning in the most mundane interactions. Harold shifts uncomfortably in his chair. I want to be clear about something before I continue. I'm not proud of what happened next. I was a married man with 2 young children, and I was falling in love with another woman. There's no excuse for that, no justification that makes it right, but I'm telling you this story because it's true, and because the truth is rarely clean and simple. It was December of 1993 when things changed. Margaret called me at the office. She'd never done that before, and said she needed to see me right away. Something in her voice made my stomach drop. I made up another excuse for Dolores and drove through a snowstorm to meet Margaret at our usual Italian place. She was already there when I arrived, sitting in our regular booth, but something was different. She looked pale, shaken. When I sat down across from her, she reached across the table and took my hands. "Harold," she said, "I'm pregnant." The words hit me like a physical blow. My first thought, God help me, was how this would destroy my marriage, my family, everything I'd built. My second thought was that this woman I'd fallen in love with was carrying my child. "Are you sure?" was all I managed to say. She nodded. 6 weeks. I've been to the doctor twice. We sat there in silence for what felt like hours. The restaurant buzzed around us, families celebrating, couples on dates, the normal rhythm of life continuing while mine fell apart. "What do you want to do?" I finally asked. Margaret looked me straight in the eyes and said, "I want to keep it. Our baby." Harold pauses, takes a sip of water from a mug that reads, "World's okayest grandpa." The next few weeks were the hardest of my life. I couldn't eat, could barely sleep. Dolores kept asking me what was wrong, if I was feeling sick. The kids wanted to know why Daddy was so quiet all the time. I felt like I was living someone else's life, like I'd stepped into a movie where I didn't know the script. Margaret and I met several more times to talk about what we were going to do. She'd made it clear she didn't want to break up my family, but she also wasn't going to get rid of the baby. She'd moved to Chicago for a fresh start after a bad relationship in New York, she told me. She had some money saved, a book contract that would pay modestly, and a fierce determination to make it work. "I don't need you to leave your wife," she said, during one of our last meetings. "I don't need your money. I just need you to know that this baby exists and that it's part of you." I wrestled with that for days. Part of me wanted to tell Dolores everything, blow up my entire life and start over with Margaret. Part of me wanted to pretend it had never happened and go back to my quiet life in Cedar Falls. But there was going to be a child, my child, growing up without knowing their father. Then, 2 weeks later, Margaret called again. This time, her voice was different, hollow, distant. "Harold, I lost the baby." The miscarriage had happened suddenly, she explained. She'd been working in her apartment, researching for her book, when the cramping started. By the time she got to the hospital, it was over. I drove to Chicago that night, not caring what excuse I gave Dolores. I found Margaret in her small apartment near Wicker Park, sitting on her couch with a cup of tea that had long gone cold. She looked so small, so broken. I held her while she cried, and I cried too, for the baby we'd lost, for the impossible situation we'd created, for all the pain we'd caused. Harold's voice becomes quieter, more reflective. That should have been the end of it. The crisis that had threatened to destroy my marriage was over. Margaret and I could part ways. I could confess to Dolores, or keep the secret forever, and life could go on. But something had changed in both of us during those few weeks of crisis. We kept seeing each other. Not as often, and the desperate urgency was gone. But we couldn't seem to let go. She finished her research and started working on her novel full-time. I got promoted to regional director, which meant even more travel and more opportunities to slip away to Chicago. Our relationship lasted 3 more years. 3 years of stolen afternoons, secret phone calls, and elaborate lies. I became a master of deception, I knew which gas stations had payphones that didn't show up on credit card statements, which restaurants were far enough off the beaten path that I wouldn't run into anyone I knew, which hotels didn't require credit cards for incidentals. Margaret published her farming book in 1975. She sent me a signed copy with an inscription that read, "To Harold, thank you for helping me understand the heart of American agriculture. With gratitude and affection, Margaret." Dolores found the book on my nightstand and asked about it. I told her it was research material from work. The lie came so easily by then. Harold takes off his glasses again, rubs his eyes. The end came in the summer of 1996. Margaret called me at the office and said she'd been offered a job with a publishing house in San Francisco. Good money, a chance to work on books about environmental issues, everything she'd been working toward. "I'm taking it," she said. "I leave in 3 weeks." We met one last time at Carmela's, the same restaurant where we'd had our first real date, where she'd told me about the pregnancy, where we'd shared so many conversations that had shaped both of our lives. She looked different, stronger, more confident. 3 years of our relationship had changed her just as it had changed me. "I need you to know something," she said, as we sat with barely touched plates of food between us. "These 3 years, they've been some of the happiest of my life, but they've also been some of the most painful. Loving someone I can't really have, being the other woman. It's not who I want to be." She reached into her purse and pulled out a manila envelope. "This is for you," she said. "Don't open it until after I leave." We said goodbye in the parking lot. It was a humid July evening, the kind where the air sits heavy on your shoulders. Margaret kissed me one last time, got in her car, a beat-up Honda Civic with a Save the Whales bumper sticker, and drove away. I stood there watching her taillights disappear into Chicago traffic, knowing I'd never see her again. Harold opens a drawer in his desk, pulls out a manila envelope worn and yellowed with age. I waited until I got home to open the envelope. Inside was a manuscript, 127 pages, printed on Margaret's old dot matrix printer. The title page read, "The Other Life," by Margaret Sinclair. Below that, in her handwriting, was a novel inspired by true events. I read the entire thing that night while Dolores and the kids slept. It was the story of a woman named Catherine who has an affair with a married man named Henry. But it wasn't just our story. Margaret had imagined what would have happened if Catherine had kept the baby, if Henry had left his wife, if they'd tried to build a life together. She'd written all the conversations we never had, all the scenarios we never lived, all the what-ifs that had haunted both of us. In the novel, Catherine and Henry's relationship ultimately fails, not because of outside pressure, but because it was built on lies and secrecy. The baby grows up confused and resentful, never understanding why Daddy can't live with them. Henry's first wife remarries and moves away with his older children, who refuse to speak to him. Catherine becomes bitter and lonely. Henry drinks too much and struggles with depression. It was brutal and honest and heartbreaking, and I recognized every emotion, every fear, every regret that had plagued me during our relationship. The last page was a letter addressed to me. "Harold, by the time you read this, I'll be halfway to California, starting the life I should have started 3 years ago. I wrote this novel not to hurt you, but to help both of us understand what we've been doing to ourselves and to the people we love. I don't regret loving you. You showed me what it means to be truly known by another person. But I can't keep living in the shadows of someone else's life. And you can't keep dividing your heart between two worlds. Go home to your wife. Tell her you love her. Not because you have to, but because part of you still does. Be the father your children deserve. Build the life you're supposed to have, not the one you think you want. I'll always carry the memory of what we shared, but I'm choosing to believe that we loved each other enough to want better for each other than what we could give. With all my love and farewell. Margaret. Harold carefully places the manuscript back in the envelope. I never told Dolores about Margaret. Maybe that makes me a coward. Maybe it makes me a protector. I honestly don't know. What I do know is that I went home that night and really looked at my wife for the first time in years. She was sleeping on her side, one hand tucked under her pillow, and I realized she was still beautiful. Not in the same way Margaret was beautiful, but beautiful in the way of shared history, of partnership, of someone who'd chosen to build a life with me. I spent the next year rebuilding my marriage. I turned down promotion opportunities that would require more travel. I coached Tommy's little league team. I helped Sarah with her school science fair project about plant growth. Ironic, considering how I'd met Margaret. The Dolores and I started talking again, really talking, about things beyond schedules and bills and kid logistics. It wasn't easy. The guilt was a constant companion. Some nights I'd lie awake wondering what Margaret was doing in San Francisco, whether she was happy, whether she'd found someone who could love her completely. But gradually, day by day, I recommitted to the life I'd chosen when I married Dolores. Harold adjusts his position, his voice taking on a different tone. Now, you might think that's the end of the story. The cheating husband sees the error of his ways, recommits to his family, and lives happily ever after. But life, as I've learned, is rarely that simple. In 2003, 7 years after Margaret had left for San Francisco, I got a call at my office from someone I didn't recognize. A young woman's voice asked, "Is this Harold McKinney?" "Yes," I said. "This is Harold. My name is Rebecca Sinclair. I think you knew my mother, Margaret Sinclair." My blood ran cold. "Yes, I knew your mother. How is she?" There was a long pause. "Mr. McKinney, my mother died 6 months ago. Cancer. I'm calling because she left some instructions about contacting you." Harold's voice becomes very quiet. Margaret had never married, Rebecca told me. She'd built a successful career as an environmental writer and editor in San Francisco. She'd traveled the world, written 3 more books, and had apparently lived a full and meaningful life. But she'd never had children. Rebecca was Margaret's niece, her sister's daughter, whom Margaret had helped raise after Rebecca's parents died in a car accident when she was 12. Margaret had been more like a mother to her than an aunt. "She talked about you sometimes," Rebecca said. "Not often, and never with details. But she'd mentioned this man from Iowa who'd helped her understand something important about herself. Before she died, she made me promise to call you and tell you something." "What?" "She wanted you to know that she never regretted the choice she made. She said to tell you that loving you taught her what she was worth, and that helped her build the life she was meant to have. She said you'd understand what that meant." "Oh!" Harold pauses for a long moment, staring at something beyond the camera. After Rebecca hung up, I sat in my office for an hour just thinking. Margaret was gone. The woman who had shown me parts of myself I'd never known existed, who had made me question everything I thought I knew about love and loyalty and desire. She was gone. That evening, I did something I'd never done before. I told Dolores about Margaret. Not everything. Not the affair. Not the pregnancy that ended in miscarriage. Not the 3 years of lies and deception. But I told her about meeting a writer at a trade show, about how she'd made me think differently about my work, about how I'd learned that she'd died. Dolores listened quietly, then asked, "Were you in love with her?" I could have lied. After all those years of lies, one more would have been easy. Instead, I said, "Yes, I was." Dolores nodded slowly. "I always wondered if there was someone. You were different for a while there in the mid-90s. Distant. I thought maybe you were having some kind of midlife crisis. Why didn't you say anything?" She smiled, not the same smile Margaret used to give me, but warm and familiar and full of understanding. "Because you came back. Whatever was pulling you away, you chose to come back. That told me everything I needed to know." Harold takes a deep breath. We talked more that night than we had in years. About dreams we'd given up, about the people we might have been, about the choices that had brought us to that moment. Dolores told me about a man she'd met at the library where she volunteered, a widower who'd asked her to coffee and whom she'd turned down because she was married, but who'd made her remember what it felt like to be seen as more than just a wife and mother. We cried together that night, for the paths not taken, for the people we'd hurt along the way, for the complexity of human hearts that want what they can't have, and often don't appreciate what they do have. Harold leans forward, directly addressing the camera. Dolores passed away 4 years ago. Pancreatic cancer. Quick and brutal. In her final weeks, when the morphine made her philosophical, she told me she was glad I'd told her about Margaret. She said it helped her understand that our marriage had survived, not because we'd never been tempted by other possibilities, but because we'd chosen each other despite those temptations. Tommy's 38 now, a software engineer in Minneapolis with 2 kids of his own. Sarah's 35, a veterinarian in Oregon, married to a good man who makes her laugh. They both turned out fine, despite having a father who spent 3 years of their childhood living a lie. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if Margaret and I had acted on those feelings instead of sneaking around. Would we have been happy? Would the children from both relationships have forgiven us eventually? Would the love that felt so powerful and important have survived the daylight of real life, real problems, real responsibilities? I'll never know. But I do know this. The heart wants what it wants, and sometimes what it wants isn't what's best for anyone involved. Margaret taught me that love isn't always enough, and that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is walk away. Harold picks up the manuscript again, runs his fingers over the worn cover. I still have Margaret's novel. I read it sometimes, usually late at night when I can't sleep. It's been published now. Rebecca found an agent who was interested in her aunt's unpublished work. It came out 3 years ago from a small press in Oregon. The author bio mentions that Margaret Sinclair was inspired by her extensive research into Midwest agricultural communities. They changed the title the Heisker, though. It's called The Weight of Secrets now. Harold looks directly into the camera, so that's my story, folks. The woman who changed everything by teaching me that some changes aren't worth making. It's not a story with a clear morale or a happy ending tied up with a bow. It's just the truth about what happened to one man who thought he could have 2 lives and learned that he could barely manage one. If you're out there carrying a secret that's eating you alive, if you're torn between the life you have and the life you think you want, I can't tell you what to do. Every situation is different, every heart is different, but I can tell you this. The people we love deserve our honesty, even when it's difficult. And sometimes the bravest thing we can do is choose the harder path that leads to less regret. Harold closes the manila envelope and sets it aside. Well, that's all for today's episode of After Her Lies. If this story resonated with you in any way, I'd be grateful if you'd leave a comment below. Tell me about a time when you had to choose between what you wanted and what was right. Or just tell me what you're thinking. I read every single comment, and your thoughts mean more to this old man than you might imagine. And hey, if you've made it this far, maybe you could hit that subscribe button. I know I mentioned those statistics earlier. 96 of you watching without subscribing, and I'm not trying to guilt-trip anyone. But if these stories from an old fool's life have any value, if they help you feel less alone with your own secrets and regrets, then maybe we can build a little community here together. Hit that like button if you think this story was worth your time, and ring that notification bell so you'll know when I post new episodes. I've got plenty more stories where this came from, some funny, some sad, some that'll make you glad you're not me, but all of them true, and all of them part of the messy, complicated, beautiful business of being human. Until next time, this is Gramps Harold, reminding you that we're all just doing our best with the hearts we've been given. Take care of yourselves out there, and be kind to one another. Harold waves at the camera with a slight smile, then reaches forward to turn it off.